Hi, everyone. Okay, so in this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit more about relativism and subjectivism. And we're going to primarily focus on relativism, but we're going to talk a little bit about subjectivism at the end and how the two are related to each other because they're sort of similar views, but they have very important differences. And so we're going to talk about what some of those differences are and then what some of the kind of common problems that remain for both views at the end. So let's start with relativism. So the basic view of relativism is just that moral facts are relativized or sort of indexed to particular groups. So there are no universally applicable moral facts or moral truths. That's not to say that there aren't any moral facts at all. There are moral facts according to this view. It's just that they don't apply to everyone in the same way. So what's morally right or wrong for you is going to be determined by the group that you belong to. So there are sort of different forms of relativism, but the most common form of relativism is cultural relativism. So relativism itself just says moral facts are just relative to particular people or particular groups. Cultural relativism specifically says the relevant group that we're talking about is your culture. So that's the level at which morality is determined for you. So what's right and wrong is going to depend and differ depending on who you are and what group you belong to. So it's not the case that there are any things that we can say are just universally wrong or right for all people. Instead, we're going to say something like, well, what's right for me is determined by my sort of culture's practices and beliefs. So it's possible that a particular act or practice could be right for me, but wrong for you because we live in different cultures. So it just says, look, moral facts are the sort of things that are determined at the level of your culture, and they can change from culture to culture. And so there's no such thing as like a universal culture neutral moral standard. So this is different from just the mere claim that people have moral disagreements across cultures. So that's a view that's sometimes called descriptive relativism because it's just kind of describing a fact about the world, which is that people across cultures have moral disagreements. That's obvious. No one really disputes that view. It's clear that there are disagreements across cultures about different practices and their moral status. And so the fact that people disagree with each other is not up for debate here. That's clear. But the claim of cultural relativism is deeper than that. It's not just about whether or not people agree about the moral facts. It's about what the moral facts themselves are and whether those moral facts apply to everyone in the same way. So the claim that everybody or that people disagree about moral facts is just going to be called descriptive relativism. Again, it's just describing a fact about the world. The latter kind of claim that the moral facts themselves actually change depending on your culture is called sometimes called normative relativism. So it's a claim about the moral truths themselves. So that latter view, normative relativism, which is making a claim about morality itself rather than just whether people agree about it, is a further claim than just descriptive relativism, and it doesn't automatically follow from descriptive relativism. So the fact that people disagree about what's right and wrong across cultures doesn't in itself, by itself, show that morality actually is different from culture to culture. So just the fact that people disagree about something, for example, doesn't mean that there's no fact of the matter about what the answer to the question is. So you might think, okay, look, the fact that people disagree about moral claims shows that there can't really be a truth of the matter about them. So we just can't settle these questions. There's no answer to them because obviously people disagree with them about them. So therefore, there's no fact of the matter. That doesn't follow from the mere fact that people disagree. Because it could be the case that people disagree about things, but someone's just wrong and someone else is just right about it. So in the Rachel's text uses this analogy of whether the Earth is flat or round. So you and I might disagree about whether the Earth is flat or round, or my culture might have beliefs that the Earth is flat and yours believes that the Earth is round. The fact that we disagree about it doesn't in itself show that there's no truth of the matter about whether the Earth is flat or round. We just think that, look, someone has gotten it wrong. The people who believe that the Earth is flat just are getting it wrong. So the fact that they disagree about it doesn't show that there's no way to settle the question. And so a similar sort of thing is going to apply in the morality case, that the mere fact that people disagree about morality doesn't in itself show that there's no truth of the matter about it. Because it could just be that different cultures have different practices, and they have different moral beliefs, but some cultures are just mistaken and others are getting it right. So that's not to say that it couldn't be the case that morality really does differ from culture to culture, or that cultural relativism is right. But the claim is just that the mere fact that people disagree is not enough to show that cultural relativism is right. We would need something extra to show that. So the sort of deeper claim about the nature of morality needs some sort of additional evidence above and beyond the mere fact that people disagree about moral claims to show that normative cultural relativism is right. Okay, so relativism, again, is going to say, okay, there are these moral facts and they differ from culture to culture. So what's right for you is different than what's right for me. And that's deeper than just saying what you believe is right is different than what I believe is right. There's a fact of the matter about what is right for you and what is right for me. And those facts are independent of just what we believe about them. But relativism still says those facts are different for you depending on your culture than they are for me, because they're determined by things at the level of our culture rather than some sort of external, independent, universal moral standards. So relativism is still what we would call a realist view about morality. So it's making the claim that there really are moral facts. It's not like there just is no such thing as a moral fact, or we're all just making it up, or we're just sort of quibbling about something that there isn't a truth of the matter about. Relativism still says, no, there really are moral facts. It's just that they're different depending where you live and where you were brought up. So that's the basic view of cultural relativism, and it has some sort of nice features to it. It's appealing. It's lots of people endorse this view, particularly when they're first starting out in philosophy. This kind of view is heard a lot in sort of intro-level ethics classes. People endorse this view. They say, look, we all sort of, are raised differently. People have different values and beliefs. They have different standards. Of course, it's going to be the case that like what's right for you is different from what's right for me. That seems obviously right because we have all these disagreements and we have a kind of diversity of views and beliefs and values, and that's a good thing. So therefore, it seems like surely that should be right, that what's true for you or what's right for you is different than what's right for me in my culture. So it's sort of it's appealing in the sense that it allows for a kind of humility about morality. If you think that there's just one truth about the matter about morality, there's just one universal standard of morality, it's easier to kind of steamroll over other people and their views. So it makes it really kind of a dangerous game to play about making moral judgments if you think that there's just one standard, and if that's true, it's pretty likely that you're going to think that what you believe about morality is true for everyone, and you're probably going to try to impose that on other people. So cultural relativism provides a kind of shield from that sort of hubris. And in a kind of global scale, it prevents a kind of threat of certain kind of imperialistic moral practices. Because again, if we look at other cultures and we see them, they have these practices and we think something's going wrong there, they're doing something evil, they're doing something barbaric, they're doing something immoral, then if you believe that there's just one truth about morality, it's very easy to sort of justify going in and imposing that standard on them, saying you have to stop this practice because we have the moral truth and you are getting it wrong, and so we're going to force you to change your practices. There's a sort of a bad way that kind of thing can go, and you can imagine quite easily how this can go wrong and get pretty sort of imperialist and violent often. And so what cultural relativism does is it kind of provides a way to shield against that sort of thing, because it says, look, you don't get to just steamroll over other people's moral beliefs because what's morally right for them is genuinely different than what's morally right for you, because that's how we think morality works. It's relative to cultures. And so it's kind of nice and appealing at first. It seems like a good kind of tolerant, let's all get along kind of moral view. But there are some problems with it that arise pretty quickly that make a lot of trouble for cultural relativist views when it turns out that they're faced with sort of what seem like obvious moral wrongs that the view now can't accommodate. So for starters, as I've just said, if you're a cultural relativist, you can't exactly find a way to criticize another culture's practices. Because again, the view is that what's right for you is determined by your culture. So you can't judge from the outside what's right for a culture. Morality is determined from within a culture. So what that means is that when we in another culture see a culture having some sort of practice or belief or behavior that we deem wrong, that would be wrong in our culture, if you think that cultural relativism is right, you don't have a way to criticize them from the outside. You can't say, you have to stop this practice, this is immoral, because what's moral for them is just determined from within their culture. So if their culture says it's right, that's all there is to it about whether it's right or wrong. So it doesn't allow us to criticize other cultures' practices. And this is particularly problematic when we come across practices that seem like they are quite obviously immoral, dangerous, violent, horrific practices. If we come across a culture that has this kind of practice that we think is just obviously wrong and harmful, we don't, on cultural relativist grounds, have a way to criticize it from the outside. So, for example, if we came across a culture that practiced slavery and was treating some subset of its population as subhuman and acting violently towards them and forcing them to work as slaves, if we came across a culture like that, and most people in the culture sort of endorsed this practice as being morally fine, we wouldn't, from the outside, have any way of criticizing them. Because remember, cultural relativism says what's right for you is determined by your culture. So if your culture basically thinks this is fine, then it really is okay. But it doesn't allow us then to say, no, this culture that's practicing slavery is doing something wrong. They're harming people. This is immoral. We have to stop them. We can't do that on cultural relativist grounds. And so if we think that there are some kinds of practices that are just obviously heinous and immoral, like slavery, cultural relativism is not going to be a satisfactory account of morality that gives us a way to really sort of a ground to stand on, morally speaking, to criticize them. So it makes it difficult to criticize other cultures' practices, for better and for worse. In a good way, it kind of prevents us from just inferring that some practice is immoral just because we have a sort of strange reaction to it. So if we see some practice and we think, okay, that practice feels icky, like I'm having this kind of inherent instinctive aversive reaction to it, cultural relativism is going to say, look, that doesn't in itself show that this is wrong, because it might just be that what's right for them is wrong for you, and that's why you're having that kind of ickiness reaction. And so that seems like a good thing, again, for kind of humility and tolerance. But when we have that kind of instinctive, horrified reaction to things like slavery or genocide, or lots of people have this reaction in response to this example that Rachel uses of female genital mutilation, things like that, and we think, that feels just in my core like something's going wrong. Cultural relativism doesn't give us a way to make sense of that. And it also doesn't give us a way to make sense of cross-cultural moral comparisons. So for example, if there were a culture that were intensely anti-Semitic, they treated Jewish people as inferior to other people, they were violent towards them, they mistreated them, if we came across a culture like that, we would have no way of saying our culture that's not anti-Semitic is better, morally speaking, than a culture that is anti-Semitic. Because again, cultural relativism just says what's right is determined by your culture. And so if your culture says anti-Semitism is fine, then that's all that it takes for it to really be fine, according to the view. And so if we want to be able to say things like, look, if you compare two cultures that are otherwise similar, it's just that one is intensely anti-Semitic and one isn't. If you want to be able to say, yeah, the one that isn't anti-Semitic is morally better than the one that is anti-Semitic, you have to do that on some grounds other than cultural relativism. You have to find some sort of culture-neutral way of settling that, of figuring out which one is better. Because you can't look from within the cultures, because according to the cultural relativist view, within the cultures, their respective practices are accepted, and so that means they're on sort of equal moral footing. So if you want to say, no, the non-anti-Semitic culture is better than the anti-Semitic one, you have to appeal to some sort of outside standard, which cultural relativism just doesn't provide. And then finally, it doesn't make sense of, or doesn't provide a way to make sense of moral progress. So because cultural relativism says, okay, what a culture believes is right, and that's just determines what's right for them, that's going to be determined by not only kind of geographical properties of the culture, but it's also going to be determined by the sort of time slice in history that the culture exists at. So culture is determined by both time and space, and so we think that, a culture, a particular country's culture changes over time. So the culture of America in the late 1700s is going to be different than the culture of America in the early 2000s. And so they're going to have different cultural beliefs, they're going to have different standards, they're going to have different practices. And according to cultural relativism, those differences are just as legitimate as differences between two cultures at the same time. So what's right for, America in 1790 is different than what's right for America in 2018. Because they have different beliefs, and therefore morality itself, according to cultural relativism, changes. But what that means is that when we come across a culture or a country that we think has made what looks like moral progress, the cultural relativist view does not give us a way to make sense of that. So take America again. We used to have this horrifying practice of slavery. America 300 years ago was practicing this behavior that we think now, when we look back on it, was so obviously morally wrong. And the fact that we don't anymore practice slavery, we think is a good thing. We think that shows something like growth or progress for our culture. So the fact that we had this practice and then we moved away from it, we think, yeah, that shows moral progress. We're a morally better society today than we were when we practiced slavery, at least in that respect. But cultural relativism, again, can't make sense of that view. It can't make sense of the idea that we are now morally better than we were when we did that. Because the cultural relativist view just says, look, as long as people endorsed this practice and the culture as a whole generally sort of accepted it, that's all it takes for it to be right, truly morally right for that culture. So it doesn't make sense to say that we're morally better now than we were then, because we're sort of on equal moral footing now as we were then, according to the relativist view. So it doesn't allow us to say things like, yeah, we were doing something wrong, and then we learned that we were doing it wrong, and now we know better now, and we've improved. It just can't make sense of that kind of story. Okay, so that's cultural relativism. That's the basic view and some of the problems that come along with the view that are commonly presented to the view. Let's spend just a couple minutes here going over subjectivism and how it's different from relativism, and then we'll just end by summing up some of these common problems that end up plaguing both views because of their similarities. So remember, cultural relativism said, okay, there really are moral facts. There is a fact of the matter about what is wrong and right. But there aren't universal moral facts. So whatever the moral facts are, they're just indexed to a culture, and they don't apply to all people equally. Subjectivism is going to say something slightly different. Subjectivism says, actually, there really just aren't any moral facts at all. People make this comparison between, moral facts and scientific facts and say, look, there's a fact of the matter about whether the earth is flat or round. There's also a fact of the matter about whether murder is wrong. Subjectivism says, actually, no, there isn't a fact of the matter about whether murder is wrong. What we're actually doing when we express moral judgments is we're just kind of expressing something like a feeling of approval or disapproval. So when I say murder is wrong, really what that means is I disapprove of murder, or I have a bad sort of feeling reaction to murder. So there isn't actually a fact of the matter independent of what we feel about whether things like murder are wrong. And so in this way, it's different than relativism, because relativism said, no, there are facts. There really are facts, and they're just like scientific facts. It's just that they change depending what your culture says, or they change from place to place. Subjectivism, on the other hand, says there are no facts about morality. It's just a mistake to think that there's a truth of the matter about whether murder is wrong that's independent of our feelings. What we're doing when we express moral judgments is we're just expressing an opinion of disapproval or a feeling. So there are, again, some kind of benefits to this view in the same way that there are benefits to relativism, in that, again, it kind of it allows for this kind of humility about moral judgments. It prevents a kind of imperialism or hubris or arrogance about morality, because it says, look, it doesn't make sense for you to sort of impose your moral views on me, because there are no moral facts anyway. There's just no fact of the matter. We're just kind of differing in opinions of approval and disapproval. That's all it is. So if that's the case, then I don't get to say, no, you're wrong, I'm right, and so I'm going to steamroll over you. So it's good in that sense. It allows for sort of diversity of views. It allows for kind of tolerance of conflicting views and disagreement. But it ends up running into problems in the same way that cultural relativism does. So one problem that arises for subjectivism that's similar to cultural relativism is that moral disagreements don't really make sense. If I disagree with you about whether murder is wrong, according to subjectivism, all that's going on is that we have a difference of taste or sort of emotional reaction to them. So what it amounts to is it's saying something like, I approve of murder and you disapprove of murder. And so when we disagree about whether murder is wrong, it's just coming down to a sort of clash of approval and disapproval. And so when we disagree about moral claims, according to subjectivism, it's sort of like we're just disagreeing about preferences in ice cream flavor or something. It's like you saying vanilla is more delicious than chocolate, and me saying no, chocolate is more delicious than vanilla. We don't have any way to we don't have any way to resolve this disagreement because we're not really disagreeing about like a factual matter. It's not as if we're disagreeing about whether the earth is flat and we could just sort of go and look at it and resolve the disagreement. It's just not that kind of disagreement. It's just sort of a difference in taste. And so subjectivism says that's basically what morality is like. It's like we're disagreeing about our taste in ice cream flavor or something. It's almost not even it's almost sort of inapt to call it a disagreement, because a disagreement implies that you're sort of making claims that conflict, and that's not even what you're doing in that case. You're just saying like yum ice cream versus, or sorry, yum vanilla versus yum chocolate. Those aren't even making claims. They're just sort of expressing a taste preference. So if that's really what all morality is just kind of an expression of approval or disapproval or taste, then we can't really figure out what's going on in moral disagreements where we think people are making clear claims about what's right and wrong, and they're trying to resolve them by arguing with each other about it. If that were a practice that made sense, you'd think, yeah, the reason they're doing that is because there's a fact that they will perhaps arrive at the end of their disagreement. There's a fact of the matter about whether it's right or wrong, and arguing helps them get closer to it. But according to subjectivism, that's just not the case. They're just sort of clashing taste, approval, or something. So that's one problem, is that moral disagreement doesn't really make sense on ethical subjectivism. But it's also the case that, and this is sort of related to this problem with moral disagreement, it's also the case that we actually just can't be wrong in our moral judgments if ethical subjectivism is true. We can't be getting it wrong ever, because if all we're doing when we make moral judgments is expressing some sort of taste or opinion of approval and disapproval, those sorts of things aren't really what we would call truth apt. They don't have conditions of correctness and incorrectness. They're just sort of like what you like and don't like. So if I said, okay, murder is wrong, and on the ethical subjectivist view, what that means is basically tantamount to me saying, I don't like murder, or I disapprove of murder. If you disagreed with me and you said, no, I disagree with your claim that murder is wrong, it would be like you were disagreeing with my claim that I like chocolate or something like that. But I can't be wrong about my claim that I like chocolate. If I like chocolate, that's sort of the end of the matter. I can't be making a mistake there or making an incorrect claim, because I'm not really making a claim at all. I'm just sort of expressing a preference. And we don't generally think that matters of taste or preference could be correct or incorrect. And so if that's really what morality is like, if saying murder is wrong is tantamount to saying I disapprove of murder or I don't like murder, there's no way for me to be getting that right or wrong. And the reason that this is a problem is that we think, generally speaking, we think people can be morally fallible. They can get things wrong morally. Sometimes we think people people have beliefs about morality that are just wrong or right. People practice things that are morally questionable. People have sort of limited knowledge about what the right thing to do is. But if all of that is true, there's got to be some way that we can evaluate their moral claims for correctness or incorrectness if we think that they can get them wrong. But if morality is just like saying, I like chocolate, if it's just like a taste or a preference, you can't be wrong about them. And that doesn't seem like it really captures how we think morality works. So this was relativism and subjectivism, and they have a lot of similarities, even though they say fundamentally different things. So remember, moral relativism says there is a fact of the matter about what's right and wrong. There are real moral facts out there, but they're just limited to a particular culture and determined from within your culture. Subjectivism says, nope, that's sort of going too far. There aren't even moral facts to begin with. When we make moral judgments, what we're doing is we're just expressing a preference. We're just sort of expressing some kind of opinion of approval or disapproval in the same way that we express taste preferences for ice cream. And so it goes a sort of a step further than cultural relativism in saying, not only is it the case that we disagree about moral claims, we're not even saying things that are tracking facts in the world when we make moral claims. We're just expressing our feelings, basically. So there are some sort of shared good things about these views. They both seem like they promote a kind of tolerance and humility about morality. It allows for a lot of kind of diversity of moral views and moral claims. It allows for a sort of, agree to disagree kind of approach to a lot of moral conflicts. And that can be nice because it prevents arrogance, it prevents imperialism about morality, and it allows for a lot of kind of human diversity. But there are these problems that end up plaguing both views. So first of all, neither view gives us a way to resolve moral disagreements. So when we have moral disagreements, either between individuals or across cultures, neither view gives us the resources to figure out who's right. And sometimes maybe that's okay. Maybe it really is okay to take a kind of agree to disagree kind of view. But there are other cases where the disagreement is about something really serious and grave. So take the female genital mutilation example. People are suffering. People are dying as a result of this practice, and lots of people criticize the view as being not only harmful but violation of autonomy. It's like a human rights violation in a lot of people's eyes, and so this is not just a kind of matter that we can say, well, look, let's just agree to disagree. This really matters whether we're getting it right or not, and so when we have these substantive moral disagreements about these very urgent questions, moral questions, it's not going to be satisfying to just say, well, we don't really have a way of resolving the disagreement. Let's just kind of, live and let live or something. That's just not going to cut it in those cases. So neither view gives us a way to resolve these kinds of moral disagreements. Neither view really gives an account of what we would call moral fallibility, or the ability to get things wrong, morally speaking. Because according to subjectivism, whatever you express morally, whatever judgments you express, are not really subject to sort of correctness evaluation. If it's just a matter of what you feel or like, you can't really be wrong about that. So it doesn't give us a way to make sense of how people can be can fail to have moral knowledge or be getting it wrong. And then with cultural relativism, the same kind of problem applies at the level of your culture. So we don't have a way of explaining why we think that slavery in several hundred years ago America was wrong, and we don't have a way of making sense of why we think we were getting it wrong then and are now getting it right. It just doesn't give us the resources to explain that, because according to the cultural relativist view, whatever our culture said at the time was right really was right. So we can't resolve moral disagreements. We don't have a good account of how we can get things wrong morally. We can't make sense of this idea of moral progress, that we were getting it wrong then, but now we're getting it right. And neither view really gives us the resources to criticize what we think are just objective moral atrocities. So things like genocide and, child marriage and human rights abuses. When those take place within cultures and we think, okay, look, just the fact that the culture generally accepts this practice does not show that it's actually okay. Neither the relativist story or the subjectivist story gives us the resources to make that kind of criticism from the outside.